Charleston, South Carolina, September 14, 1863. Inside a photography studio on King Street, a man named Jonathan Whitmore was about to commit a crime. Not with a weapon, not with a document, with a camera. Two women walked through his studio door that morning dressed identically, silk dresses with intricate lace collars, hair pinned with careful precision, gloved hands folded in their laps in the exact manner of wealthy Charleston ladies. They had rehearsed this. They had to. Because what they were about to do carried consequences that could destroy all three of them: Jonathan Whitmore, the photographer who let them in; Elizabeth Ashford, age 28, daughter of one of Charleston's most prominent plantation families; and the woman seated beside her, wearing the same quality of dress, sitting in the same quality of chair, Sarah, age 26. Enslaved, listed in the Ashford household inventory as a lady's maid, property, under Confederate law, of the man who was Elizabeth's father. Also, under a truth that law refused to acknowledge, Elizabeth's half-sister. Whitmore set the exposure. The shutter opened. For one fraction of a second, two sisters sat together as equals in a world that had built its entire economy on the proposition that Sarah was not a person at all. The police would come to King Street the next morning. Richard Ashford, the man who owned Sarah, who had fathered her, who had never once spoken her name in public, would be dead within 7 weeks. And Sarah herself, within 4 months of that photograph being taken, would be on an auction block in Montgomery, Alabama, sold away from everyone she'd ever known, sent deeper into the Confederacy as punishment for exactly the kind of dignity that image had captured. The photograph survived anyway. Whitmore hid the negative inside the wall of his studio, where it would remain sealed for 26 years. It would survive the siege of Charleston, survive the war itself, survive Whitmore's death in 1889, pass through the hands of a collector who didn't know what he had, sit misfiled in an archive for 92 more years, labeled absurdly as Two Ladies of Charleston, Unknown Subjects. Waiting for the morning in March 2019, when a historian named Dr. Rebecca Torres opened a leather-bound catalogue to page 47 and leaned in close enough to notice a thin, dark line on the wrist of the woman on the right. A scar. Or maybe something else entirely. That detail would take 8 months to explain. What it ultimately revealed about one enslaved woman's survival, about a white Southern woman's radical act of conscience, about a photographer's quiet abolitionism in the heart of Confederate territory, and about a reunion in Philadelphia that no one was supposed to know happened, is the story buried inside that photograph for nearly a century. This is what history was designed to forget. Before we go any further into what happened inside that King Street studio on September 14, 1863, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to Hollow Century and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one, stories where 3 ordinary people risked everything for one honest moment, these are exactly the stories that get buried again unless someone refuses to let them die. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Let's see how far this truth travels. Now back to Charleston. To understand why 2 women sitting side by side in a photograph constituted a revolutionary act, you have to understand what Charleston, South Carolina, was in September of 1863. It was a city under siege, and it had been since the spring. Union forces had been bombarding the harbor and the barrier islands since April, steadily tightening a noose around what had been less than 3 years earlier the wealthiest city in North America. The shells came most nights. The wealthy families who could afford to leave had mostly gone to relatives in Virginia, to summer homes further inland, to anywhere the artillery didn't reach after dark. The ones who remained did so because they had too much to protect, too much property to abandon, or simply nowhere left to go. The city those families were defending had been built on a specific proposition: that human beings of African descent were not human beings at all, but property, and that this was not merely legal but ordained. South Carolina had been the first state to secede. Its ordinance of secession did not dress up the reason in the language of states' rights or tariffs. It named slavery directly, in plain English, as the institution it was seceding to protect. The men who wrote that document were proud of it. They considered themselves civilized. The legal infrastructure of that civilization was elaborate and specific. South Carolina's slave codes, in place since 1712 and refined for 150 years, governed every interaction between white and black with the precision of an instruction manual. Enslaved people could not gather in groups of more than 7 without a white person present. They could not carry a firearm without written permission. They could not testify in court against a white person. They could not legally marry. They could not own property. They could not, under any circumstances, be treated as the equal of a white person, not in public, not in private, not in speech, not in posture, not in dress. That last rule was not metaphorical. Dress codes were real and enforced. An enslaved person appearing in clothing above their station, silk, lace, fine fabric, could be stripped, whipped, sold. The social signal of clothing was the architecture of hierarchy. A woman in silk was a lady. A woman in cotton was property. The system required that these categories never blur. Literacy for enslaved people was a crime, not a misdemeanor. Teaching a slave to read could earn a white person a fine or imprisonment. The logic was straightforward. Literate people could read anti-slavery literature. They could write passes for themselves and escape. They could communicate across distances. Knowledge was freedom's infrastructure, and so knowledge had to be destroyed. And yet, because the contradiction at the heart of slavery was irresolvable, the same wealthy plantation families who enforced these codes with the whip also brought enslaved women into their homes, made them house servants, ladies' maids, made them intimate attendants to the women of the household, present at every private moment. They learned the family's secrets, they witnessed everything. And sometimes, more often than history was permitted to record, they were something else entirely. The polite term when such things were discussed at all was irregular family connections. The honest term was rape. Planters who raped the women they enslaved produced children they did not acknowledge, children who might share their bone structure, their eye color, their surname by rumor if never by law. Those children were still slaves. That was the legal reality. But they lived inside the household. They knew things. And sometimes, in the close quarters of a plantation home or a Charleston townhouse, the white daughters and the half-sisters they were never permitted to call sisters grew up together, separated by a chasm the law had built between them, close enough to understand exactly what that chasm cost. This was the world Elizabeth, Ashford, and Sarah had been born into. The war that was now shaking Charleston's foundations had not, as of September 1863, changed any of that. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had been issued in January, but it was a military order that applied to Confederate-held territory the Union did not yet control. In Charleston in September 1863, the slave codes were still the law. The auction blocks were still operating. People were still being bought and sold. Into that world, on a Tuesday morning in the middle of a war, 2 women walked into a photographer's studio on King Street and sat down together as sisters. Her name was Sarah. That is the only name the official records give her. One name, no surname, no middle name, no acknowledgement of father or family. In the Ashford household inventory of 1864, she appears as a single line: Sarah, age 27, lady's maid, appraised value $800. $800. At a time when a skilled male field hand might sell for $1,200, when a young woman with dressmaking skills might bring $1,400, $800 was a figure that reflected something, a deliberate downward assessment, perhaps, of a woman whose proximity to the family's most intimate secrets made her dangerous at full market value. But Sarah was not a line in an inventory. She was a person, and the documents she left behind, hidden in a small leather journal that survived against every probability, tell us who she was with a specificity that the ledgers never could. She was born in January 1837 on the Ashford rice plantation, 15 miles outside Charleston. Her mother was Hannah, an enslaved woman who had been purchased by Richard Ashford in 1831, listed in his estate documents as mulatto, house-trained, literate, age 19. Hannah had been born in 1812, somewhere in Virginia, in circumstances we cannot now recover. She had arrived at the Ashford plantation at 19 years old, literate in a state where that was already an extraordinary thing for an enslaved person to be, carrying whatever she carried from wherever she had come from. Sarah was born 6 years after her mother arrived at the Ashford property. The father is not named in any official document. It did not need to be. Richard Ashford had been a widower since 1835, his wife Elena having died after a difficult second pregnancy and the birth of an enslaved child on his own plantation in 1837 to a woman who had been on that plantation for 6 years. required no detective work to explain. It simply required honesty, which the records declined to provide. Hannah died of fever in 1847 when Sarah was 10 years old. We do not know what those last days looked like. We do not know if Sarah was permitted to stay with her mother. We do not know who, if anyone, comforted a 10-year-old child who had just lost the only person she belonged to in the world. What we know is that Sarah survived it, and that somehow in the years that followed, she carried forward the most extraordinary thing her mother had left her. Hannah had been literate, and she had taught her daughter. This was an act of profound defiance. In South Carolina in the 1840s, teaching an enslaved child to read was not merely illegal, it was an act that could, if discovered, cost Hannah everything. What she chose to risk tells us something about what she believed her daughter deserved. What Sarah chose to do with that gift tells us who Sarah was. By the time Richard Ashford moved his household to the Charleston townhouse in the early 1850s, for the social season, and increasingly full-time as the plantation required less of his personal attention, Sarah had become his daughter Elizabeth's personal maid. This was partly practical. Elizabeth, born in 1835, was roughly Sarah's age, and the two had grown up in proximity on the plantation. It was also perhaps something else, a deliberate placement by Richard Ashford of a daughter he could not acknowledge near a daughter he could, in a relationship the law called service and the facts called something more complicated. Elizabeth Ashford was by all accounts her father's primary companion in his later years. Her mother had died when Elizabeth was 4 years old. Her one sibling, a brother named Thomas, had died of yellow fever at age 12. Richard Ashford had the cold, driven personality of a man who had turned grief into acquisition. More land, more slaves, more rice, more property. And Elizabeth had grown up in the shadow of that grief, managing his Charleston household with quiet efficiency, entertaining his business partners, reading the newspapers to him when his eyes began to fail in the late 1850s. What Elizabeth knew about Sarah, about their shared father, about what Richard Ashford had done to Hannah, we can reconstruct only from Sarah's journal and from Elizabeth's letters. What we can say is that both women grew up understanding the nature of their connection, and that both of them were required by every law and social custom of their world to pretend that understanding did not exist. Sarah writes about this in her journal with a restraint that makes the emotion more powerful, not less. She describes small moments of contact that the official relationship between a lady and her maid would not explain, a hand squeezed quickly out of sight of the household, when news arrived that a neighboring family had sold an enslaved child, and the child's mother had not stopped screaming for 3 days. A look exchanged across a dinner table when Richard Ashford spoke approvingly of the slave codes. The wordless communication of two people who had been sharing a secret since childhood and had learned that the secret itself was a kind of bond. She writes about her fear with the same restraint, the fear of being sold, the fear of saying too much to the wrong person, the fear that whatever thin protection her proximity to Elizabeth provided would one day evaporate, that Richard Ashford would die or ruin himself, or simply decide that Sarah's presence was inconvenient, and that she would find herself on a block in downtown Charleston with no one to advocate for her and $800 worth of reasons for strangers to bid. She writes about her intelligence, about the way she had learned by necessity to read people, to understand within minutes of a new arrival at the household whether they were the kind of person who would report her for something or the kind who would look away. About the way she catalogued information without writing it down because her journal was itself a risk and she could not write everything. About the way she had survived 17 years in a household run by her own father without his ever once acknowledging that fact. What she wanted, what she wrote about when she was most careful, when the handwriting grew small and cramped and she was clearly afraid of anyone else reading it, was not revenge, not escape, not justice in any formal sense. What she wanted was for someone to say her name in full, her whole name, with the acknowledgement of what it meant. She writes in the summer of 1863, with the sound of artillery audible from the direction of the harbor, "I have thought often of what Mother would say if she could see this place now. She would say she always knew the walls would shake. She would say that walls built on lies must eventually shake. I think she would be right." That was Sarah. That was the woman who walked into Jonathan Whitmore's studio on September 14, 1863, not passive, not defeated, not a victim who needed rescuing. She was a woman who had survived by her intelligence for 26 years, who had kept her mother's gift alive under conditions designed to destroy it, who had been waiting with patience born of necessity for the moment when the walls finally started to shake. Richard Ashford was not a monster by anyone's public reckoning in 1863 Charleston. He was a pillar. He had arrived in the Carolina Lowcountry in 1828 at the age of 28, from Virginia, with a small inheritance, ambition, and the skills of a man who understood that in the South Carolina rice country, land and labor were the only currencies that ultimately mattered. He had purchased his first 40 acres and 6 enslaved workers in 1829. By 1855, he owned 1,400 acres, 37 enslaved people, and a townhouse on Meeting Street in one of Charleston's most fashionable districts. He was a member of St. Michael's Episcopal Church. He had served on the Charleston Board of Trade. He had subscribed to the fund to restore the circular Congregational Church after the fire of 1861. He was, in every way the city measured such things, a respectable man. The contradiction at the center of Richard Ashford's respectability was one that the city of Charleston had built an entire civilization around not seeing. He had raped an enslaved woman in his care. He had produced a child. He had spent 30 years watching that child grow up inside his household, grow up into a woman who looked enough like him that visitors occasionally noted the resemblance without knowing what they were noticing. And he had maintained, without apparent difficulty, the comfortable fiction that this was not his concern. His will, written in 1857, includes one line that suggests he knew exactly what he was refusing to acknowledge. The bequest is oddly specific. Upon my death, the girl Sarah is to be granted special consideration in her placement or sale, as her circumstances warrant particular discretion. The phrase is a masterwork of careful language. It acknowledges that Sarah's circumstances are unusual. It asks for discretion. It promises her nothing and offers no explanation. This is how the system worked, not through outright monsters but through carefully maintained fictions, through documents that technically did not lie while omitting everything that mattered. Richard Ashford was not unusual, he was the rule. Across the plantation South, the same dynamics repeated with the same language. Special consideration, particular circumstances, ledgers that recorded the names of enslaved children without recording who fathered them, in a world where it required no detective work to know. The system that protected Richard Ashford was not merely cultural. It was legal, institutional, and enforced with violence. Under South Carolina law in 1863, the children of enslaved mothers inherited their mother's status regardless of their father's race or social position. This law existed specifically to protect the arrangement that Richard Ashford and thousands of men like him relied upon. It guaranteed that rape could never create an heir. It guaranteed that a planter could assault the women he enslaved without legal consequence, produce children he could subsequently sell, and face no legal challenge to his respectability. The law was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. The clergy looked away, the courts enforced it. The neighbors knew and maintained the fiction because the fiction was the price of membership in a society that benefited from it. Any man who publicly acknowledged what was known privately became a destabilizing threat, not because his actions were unique, but because acknowledgement of what he'd done would require acknowledging what everyone around him had also done. Richard Ashford fell seriously ill in the fall of 1863. By October, he was largely confined to his room. By November 3rd, he was dead, heart failure, according to his death certificate, complications of illness. He died in his Meeting Street townhouse with his legitimate daughter at his bedside, and most likely Sarah somewhere in the household, performing the functions of a lady's maid to a woman whose grief and guilt were, by this point, no longer entirely separable. He died without having acknowledged Sarah once in his official life. He died 9 weeks after the photograph was taken. And with him died whatever thin, unspoken protection his presence might have offered Sarah, leaving her exposed to the cousins, the creditors, the court-appointed administrators, and the auction houses that would, within 4 months, complete the transaction he had started when he listed her value in his household inventory. $800. September 14, 1863. King Street, Charleston, Whitmore's photography studio, 9 o'clock in the morning. Elizabeth Ashford had planned this for weeks. She had to. The logistics alone required planning that could not look like planning. She could not simply arrive at a photography studio with an enslaved woman and announce that she wished to be photographed as equals. That sentence would have ended the session before it began and might have ended considerably more than the session. She needed Jonathan Whitmore specifically, not some other photographer, and she needed to know that Whitmore was what people quietly said he was. A man whose publicly cautious silence on political matters concealed, for those who knew how to ask, something closer to abolitionist conviction. How Elizabeth found Whitmore, how she tested whether he could be trusted, we cannot know for certain. What we know is that in his letter to his brother in Boston, written 6 days after the sitting, Whitmore describes the approach as deliberate and calculated. A woman, he writes, came to him first alone 3 days before the session and spoke carefully about a private sitting she wished to arrange. The conversation moved in circles for several minutes before she asked him directly whether he believed a man's legal standing was the same thing as his moral standing. Whitmore told her he did not. She came back the next day with the details. The morning of the 14th was overcast, which was useful. Bright sun through a studio window was a photographic problem that required the subjects to hold their positions longer while the plate was exposed, and longer meant more risk of someone walking past the studio window and wondering. Whitmore had drawn his curtain and used his oil lamp to supplement the light. Elizabeth arrived first. She was dressed in her best day dress, the dove-grey silk she wore for social calls with lace at the collar and cuffs, her hair arranged with the particular care of a woman who understood that every detail was a message. She had to look exactly like herself, a Charleston lady of good family on a routine errand, nothing unusual to attract attention from the street. Sarah arrived separately by the back entrance 10 minutes later. This is documented in Whitmore's letter. He writes that he had expected nervousness from both women and was prepared for second thoughts. What he found instead, he writes, was something that struck him as the most purposeful calm I have ever witnessed in any person, man or woman, black or white. Both women entered the studio room and immediately arranged themselves in the chairs before the camera, Elizabeth on the left, Sarah on the right, without needing to be directed. They had discussed the positioning. They had decided together that they would sit side by side rather than in any arrangement that suggested hierarchy. Sarah was wearing a silk dress. This alone, this single detail, carried a weight that we in the 21st century have to consciously reconstruct. A silk dress in September 1863 Charleston on an enslaved woman was not a fashion choice. It was an argument. It was Sarah and Elizabeth saying without words in the only language available to them that what the law stated about dress and status and the meaning of cloth was false. The dress had been Elizabeth's. She had given it to Sarah for the sitting and helped her dress in it herself that morning. They had agreed. The photograph would show them as they were to each other, not as they were required to appear to the world. Whitmore prepared his wet collodion plate, coating it with chemicals in the adjacent darkroom, and worked with efficient speed. He was a professional, and he understood that speed was now protection for everyone in the room. He slid the plate into the camera housing and moved to the shutter. He asked if they were ready. Elizabeth looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Elizabeth. The shutter opened. It stayed open for approximately 15 seconds, long enough, under the available light, to capture the image that would survive everything that was about to happen to both of them. Whitmore processed the negative himself immediately in his darkroom before anyone else entered the studio. He made one print, then he wrapped the negative in oilskin, the material used to protect documents from moisture, and placed it inside a cavity he had previously identified inside the plaster of his back wall, which showed a gap where old lathe had cracked. He pushed it deep into the wall and replastered the surface. The photograph existed in two forms now, the print, which he gave to Elizabeth, and the negative, which was inside his wall. Elizabeth left by the front door, the print rolled and tucked inside the sleeve of her dress. Sarah left by the back. Neither of them knew what was coming the next morning. Jonathan Whitmore was born in Boston in 1822 and had arrived in Charleston in 1855, age 33, carrying photography equipment, a modest amount of capital, and a set of convictions he had learned very quickly not to advertise. He had grown up in a Unitarian household in Boston's South End, his father a bookbinder, his mother a teacher in one of the African American community's mutual aid schools. He had absorbed his parents' abolitionism the way children absorb things their parents consider obvious, as simply the correct view of the world. It was only when he arrived in Charleston, drawn by the opportunities of a photographic market that was still relatively unsaturated in the mid-1850s, that he understood with physical shock the gap between the world he had grown up in and the world he had entered. He wrote to his brother Frederick about it in 1856, a letter that survived in the Whitmore family papers. The degree to which an entire civilization has organized itself around the maintenance of a single lie requires a witness to see in person before it can be believed. I have now been that witness. I understand now why Father said what he said about the difference between reading about it and seeing it. I have seen it. I see it every day. But Whitmore stayed. The reasons were partly practical. He had invested his capital, he had signed a lease, he had clients who paid well and promptly, and partly, he would write later, he stayed because leaving felt like abandonment. He was in a position, however small, to be useful. People who needed photographs taken of events, families, beloved faces before soldiers departed. He was there for all of them, black and white alike, as discreetly as the law and social custom permitted. Over 8 years in Charleston, Whitmore had developed a reputation as trustworthy, careful, and professionally excellent. He photographed wealthy families, officers in their new Confederate uniforms, women in their best dresses before husbands and sons went to war. He photographed, when he could do so without attracting attention, some of the free black families of Charleston as well, a smaller number than he would have wished, because every interaction crossed a line that could be reported and someone was always watching. But he kept his records carefully, his studio clean, his opinions to himself in public, and his conscience alive in private correspondence to Frederick in Boston. He had never done anything like September 14th before. In his letter to Frederick written the week after the sitting, he describes the night before with unusual candor. He had not slept. He had sat in his back room with a lamp and thought through every possible consequence, arrest, business ruin, physical harm, and decided that none of them were sufficient reason to turn Elizabeth Ashford away when she returned the next morning to confirm the appointment. When a young woman comes to you knowing full well the danger, asking only to have one true image of herself and her sister, a sister the law denies exists, how can one refuse? He writes, I am in Charleston, not Boston, but I did not stop being my father's son when I crossed the state line. He understood what the photograph was, not merely a portrait, a document, evidence of a relationship that the legal system had gone to considerable lengths to deny. Two women who shared a father, documented in a formal portrait as formal equals, by a professional photographer whose name and studio address would appear on the back of the print, if anyone ever pressed the print hard enough to read the embossed stamp. He knew the danger, he hid the negative in his wall, he hoped for a world in which it would matter. What he did not know, sitting in his back room the night of the 14th, was that someone had already seen something. The Charleston Police Daily Report for September 15, 1863, filed the morning after the sitting, includes a 3-line entry in the middle of a page of routine notations. Report received from citizen regarding suspicious activity at photography establishment on King Street. Officers investigated. Premises found in order. No action taken. The entry lists no name for the reporting citizen. It does not describe what suspicious activity was alleged. It was the kind of entry that was written to document that a report had been received and investigated, while saying as little as possible about either. Someone had been watching the studio. Someone had seen something, a woman dressed above her station perhaps, or simply two women who should not have been arriving separately at the same address. The report had been made, the officers had come. They had found a photography studio in order, a professional who expressed polite confusion at their presence, and nothing they could point to as evidence of anything. Whitmore, questioned about this moment in the 1866 court case where he appeared as a witness, said only that he had been visited by officers who found nothing requiring their attention. His expression when saying this, the reporter notes, was described as perfectly composed. He was a man who had spent 8 years learning to be composed. The morning of September 15, 1863, less than 24 hours after the photograph was taken, Elizabeth Ashford received a visitor. His name was William Guthrie, and he was Richard Ashford's attorney. He was also, in the particular way of Charleston's professional class, a man whose legal services and social opinions were inseparable. He arrived at the Meeting Street townhouse at 10 o'clock in the morning, before Richard Ashford had come downstairs, and spoke to Elizabeth in the front parlor with the door closed. The precise content of that conversation is not recorded in any document that survives. What we know comes from Elizabeth's letters to her cousin Catherine in Virginia, letters that became increasingly frank as the fall of 1863 progressed and Elizabeth's circumstances narrowed. She writes about Guthrie's visit in a letter dated September 18th. He came to remind me as though I required reminding of the proper order of things. He spoke about father's health. He spoke about the estate. He spoke about the considerable interest that certain of father's associates have taken in the question of what becomes of particular household assets when father is no longer here to manage them himself. He did not say your name. He did not need to. The proper order of things. The phrase is Elizabeth's, written with an edge that the careful formality of her other correspondence makes stand out like a bruise. She understood what Guthrie was telling her. Richard Ashford was dying. The cousins, Robert Ashford and his brother James, who had been circling the estate for years, were watching, and the household inventory, which included the line Sarah, age 27, lady's maid. Appraised value, $800, was an asset in an estate that the cousins fully intended to control. Sarah writes about this period in her journal with a compression that suggests she understood she might have limited time to write at all. The entries from the fall of 1863 are shorter, more guarded, stripped of the reflective quality of the earlier entries. She writes about Richard Ashford's decline in clinical terms, the coughing, the weakness, the days when he did not come downstairs. She writes about the cousins' visits, how Robert Ashford walked through the house with the particular quality of attention that a man pays to things he believes will soon belong to him. She writes in October a single line that reads like a preparation: "I have memorized everything that matters. If they take the book, I will still have the book." This was Sarah's form of resistance, the one form available to her that left no physical evidence. She was memorizing her own history. Names, dates, relationships, the content of documents she had been present when Elizabeth read aloud, the specifics of transactions and conversations, and the texture of a life that the official record was designed to erase. She was building inside herself an archive that could not be confiscated. The pattern that makes this story more than one family's tragedy is visible in the records of the period. What was happening to Sarah was not unusual, it was institutional. Across the plantation South, the practice of keeping enslaved women in intimate proximity to the family, as ladies' maids, as house servants in the compound domestic relationships that slavery created, while simultaneously maintaining the legal fiction that those women were property to be sold or transferred at will, was standard. It was not the exception. The exceptions were the people like Elizabeth who refused to pretend that the contradiction wasn't there. Robert Ashford filed his first probate challenge in January 1864, 6 weeks after Richard Ashford's death on November 3rd. The grounds were explicit, and in the language of South Carolina probate law, perfectly formed. Elizabeth was unfit to manage the estate because she had been unduly influenced by servants and Northern sympathizers, had failed to maintain proper discipline in the household, and had demonstrated an inappropriate and unnatural attachment to certain enslaved persons inconsistent with sound management of property. The witnesses the cousins produced were neighbors, former household staff, one of Richard Ashford's business partners. They testified about small things: Elizabeth eating at the same table as household servants during the chaos of the siege, Elizabeth permitting Sarah to read in the parlor rather than the servants' quarters, Elizabeth being observed in what one witness described as a conversation of a personal nature unsuitable to the relationship of mistress and servant. Not one of them mentioned the photograph, not one of them needed to. The court ruled in the cousins' favor in March 1864. Elizabeth was stripped of control of the estate, an administrator was appointed, the household inventory was reviewed, and the assets, all of them, were prepared for sale. Sarah appears in the sale records on March 15, 1864. Sarah, aged 27 years, house servant, lady's maid, sold to broker for transport to auction, Montgomery, Alabama. Price received $725. $75 below appraised value. A discount perhaps, reflecting the broker's sense that a Charleston house made with unusual literacy and a recent history of inappropriate relationships with her owner's family was a liability rather than an asset at full price. She was transporting south in a coffle. The chain gangs used to move enslaved people between markets, sometime in late March or early April of 1864. She had been given no warning. The morning she was taken from the Meeting Street house is not documented in any record, but in the margin of the last page of her journal, a page that is otherwise blank, there are 4 words written in a different, shakier hand than the other entries, not Sarah's hand. The handwriting is Elizabeth Ashford's. I tried, I failed, forgive. If you're still with us, and you should be because this story is only getting darker before it gets light, make sure you've subscribed to Hollow Century and hit that notification bell. What you're hearing right now, the mechanics of how a legal system could strip a woman of her home, sell her sister, and call it due process, this is the history that gets reduced to a footnote if we let it. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what history actually looked like when you stripped away the comfortable version. Hit the like button. And stay with us, because what happens next are what Sarah does, what Elizabeth does, and what an old journal buried in a Philadelphia archive finally proves. That's where this story turns. Dr. Rebecca Torres was 39 years old when she found the photograph on page 47 of the Southern Portraits catalog, and she had spent 15 years studying Civil War era photography, specifically because she believed that images contained truths that official records were designed to suppress. She had grown up in San Antonio, the daughter of a history teacher father and a librarian mother, in a household where the question of whose history got written down was a regular dinner table subject. She had written her dissertation at the University of Texas on photographic representation of enslaved people in antebellum studio portraits, specifically on the ways enslaved individuals who appeared in formal photographs alongside white family members had been systematically misidentified, mislabeled, or cropped from later reproductions of those images. She knew what she was looking for, in other words, when she walked into the Charleston Historical Society's archive in March 2019. The mark on the wrist was the first thing. She photographed it, zoomed in on her laptop over lunch, and confirmed that it was not a shadow or a photographic artifact. It was a thin, dark line, slightly raised, consistent with scar tissue from a wound that had healed. Not a whip scar, the placement was wrong for that. Something else. Something that had happened to the right woman's wrist at some point in her life and left a permanent mark. The calluses were the second thing, visible through the fabric of the gloves at the base of the fingers of the right hand, the particular pattern of calluses that forms from repetitive manual labor, not the hands of a lady of leisure, the hands of a woman who worked, dressed for a single morning in a silk dress and gloves that were not her own. Rebecca returned to the archive the next morning with a purpose she had not had the morning before. She requested records from Whitmore's photography studio. The archivist, a man named Harrison who had worked at the Historical Society for 30 years and had developed the careful neutrality of a man who had seen researchers become obsessed with things that turned out to be nothing, retrieved 3 boxes of documents and watched her work with the quiet assessment of long experience. The ledger entry for September 14, 1863, 2 subjects, private sitting, payment received in advance, no names recorded per client request, was anomalous by the standards of the period. Whitmore's other entries named his subjects. He recorded them for business purposes, for future orders, for the professional record. The absence of names was a deliberate choice. Someone had paid for anonymity. Whitmore's Boston newspaper obituary from 1889, which Rebecca found by searching the Massachusetts State Historical Database, described him as known among his intimates for quiet abolitionist sympathies, maintained with discretion during his years in the South. The language was careful, written for a northern audience, posthumous, safe to say now, but it confirmed what she suspected. The photographer had known exactly what he was doing and why the names weren't in the ledger. She found the newspaper article about the 1866 court case by the end of her second day. Whitmore's testimony, noted briefly by the Charleston Mercury reporter, confirmed him as a witness to events in the city during the war years. The reporter's parenthetical observation, known for abolitionist sympathies, carefully kept, was the confirmation she needed. Rebecca cross-referenced the September 14th date with household records from the major families who had been in Charleston that autumn. The Ashford estate records had been donated to the Historical Society in 1923 by a distant relative who had found them in a storage room and had no idea what to do with them. They included Richard Ashford's will, the household inventory, the probate challenge documents, and critically, the letters Elizabeth Ashford had written to her cousin Catherine in Virginia between 1862 and 1864. The phrase, "I have made a decision that would horrify our society, but my conscience permits no other course," appeared in Elizabeth's letter of August 1863. Rebecca read it 3 times. The household inventory that listed Sarah, age 27, lady's maid, provided the connection. Rebecca checked Hannah's purchase record from 1831. She checked the birth registration from the plantation records of 1837. She checked the timeline. It was circumstantial. She knew it was circumstantial. She needed Sarah's voice. The leather journal was in the collection of donated papers from the Ashford family connection. It had been catalogued as household accounts, miscellaneous Ashford estate, the kind of nondescription that archivist shorthand applied to materials that didn't fit neatly into the existing categories. The handwriting was small, cramped, irregular, the handwriting of someone who had learned without formal instruction and had learned to write small because paper was a resource that could not be replaced easily. Rebecca opened it and began to read. "Miss Elizabeth gave me this book. She says I should write my thoughts, though I scarce know what to write that would not bring danger." She read for 4 hours without stopping. When she finally set the journal down, the archive was preparing to close, and the light through the tall windows had gone the particular color of a winter afternoon in Charleston, gray-gold, long-shadowed, the kind of light that made the past feel very close. She photographed every page. Then she sat at the wooden table for a long time without doing anything, thinking about a woman who had hidden her writing inside a journal catalogued as household accounts, and had managed, by that accident of mislabeling, to survive for 156 years until someone opened it. Sarah's journal is not a dramatic document. It does not announce its revelations. It accumulates them carefully in the handwriting of a woman who had been trained by years of survival to say exactly what she meant while appearing to say very little. The entry dated March 1863 is the one that made Rebecca Torr's hands shake. "She told me today straight out with tears in her eyes, 'We share a father, Sarah. You are my sister, though the world will never acknowledge it. I knew it in my bones already. I see his features in my mirror the same as in hers,' but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like lightning striking. Not discovery, confirmation. Sarah had known for years. The mirror had been telling her for years. But the spoken acknowledgement, Elizabeth, standing in the parlor of their shared father's house, saying the words out loud for the first time, that was different. That was Elizabeth choosing truth over comfort at a moment when everything in her upbringing and social position argued against it. The journal documents Elizabeth's transformation over the course of 1863, with the clarity of someone watching it happen from close range. Elizabeth had always been, in Sarah's description, more uncomfortable with the household's arrangements than most. There is an entry from 1862 that describes Elizabeth dismissing an overseer for mistreating field workers, a decision that cost her a fierce argument with her father and a 2-week silence between them. But the spring of 1863 brought something different. The artillery was audible, the siege was tightening, Richard Ashford's health was visibly declining, and Elizabeth had begun to understand that when he died, whatever thin protection his presence had provided to Sarah would die with him. Martha Thompson's diary, found by Rebecca in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, provides a different angle. Martha Thompson had been running her Philadelphia boarding house as a way station on the informal network of abolitionists and allies since 1858. She had seen hundreds of refugees. She was not easily surprised. Her entry about Elizabeth's arrival in July 1864 is brief. "A young woman from South Carolina arrived this evening, referred by the Friends meeting in Wilmington. She is educated, composed, and has lost everything. She asks only for work and the address of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in this district. She says she has a sister she hopes to find." Martha does not editorialize, but the specificity of a sister she hopes to find from a white Southern woman in 1864 Philadelphia is its own testimony. Elizabeth had not lost hope. She had fled Charleston with nothing and arrived in the city with one purpose. The reunion entry in November 1864 is the longest entry in Martha Thompson's diary that year. "Today, a young woman of color arrived at our door exhausted and desperate. She had escaped from Alabama, she said, traveled for weeks, guided by brave conductors. She asked if we knew of an Elizabeth Ashford. When I confirmed that Elizabeth had stayed with us earlier this year, the woman began to weep with relief. She says they are sisters. The reunion between Elizabeth and Sarah was the most profound thing I have witnessed in all my years of this work. They held each other and wept for an hour. Elizabeth kept saying, "I tried to free you before they took you. I failed you." And Sarah kept saying, "You freed me in every way that mattered long before I left that place." Martha Thompson had helped facilitate hundreds of reunions between people separated by slavery. She had seen profound things. She wrote that sentence, "The most profound thing I have witnessed in all my years of this work," deliberately, with the weight of comparison behind it. Two women in a city neither had been born in, reunited across an impossible distance, in a boarding house run by a Quaker woman who had made her dining room into a way station for people the law had tried to destroy. The witnesses to this moment were three women. Not one of them had any power in the conventional sense. Not one of them was protected by law, wealth, or social status in a form that would survive the wrong person's attention. And yet the record they left, Martha's diary, Elizabeth's letters to Catherine, Sarah's journal, constitutes a more complete and honest account of what it meant to be a person in 1863 South Carolina than anything the official record provides. Dr. Marcus Williams, the Civil War social historian whom Rebecca consulted in the fall of 2019, put it plainly when she showed him the documentation she had assembled. What Elizabeth Ashford and Sarah did from the moment they sat for that photograph to the moment they found each other in Philadelphia is among the most remarkable documented acts of defiance of the Civil War era, and it survived only because three women thought to write it down. Resistance in the context of American slavery rarely looked like uprising. It could not afford to. Uprising brought death. Resistance looked like something smaller and in many ways more extraordinary. It looked like survival with dignity intact, like the preservation of truth in forms that could outlast the system designed to erase it. Sarah had been resisting since she was old enough to understand what was being asked of her. The literacy her mother Hannah had given her was in itself resistance, the most fundamental kind, in a system that made reading illegal for enslaved people specifically because reading was access to the ideas that named what was being done to them. Teaching your child to read was an act of extraordinary defiance. Hannah had been literate, purchased perhaps partly for that skill, and she had used the very thing that made her useful to Richard Ashford as the means of arming her daughter against him. Sarah used that literacy carefully. The journal is the most visible evidence, but the journal is only what survived. The larger practice was what she describes in the entries themselves, the habit of mental record keeping, of storing information in forms that couldn't be confiscated. Names, dates, prices paid, conversations overheard and memorized. The transaction details of an estate she lived inside but was not permitted to be a party to. She had been building for years a parallel archive of everything the official record erased. She describes, in an entry from the summer of 1862, a specific act of small resistance that reveals how finely calibrated this practice was. A man had come to the house, a business associate of Richard Ashford's from Columbia, who had spoken at dinner about an enslaved man he intended to sell, and had given enough detail about the man's family circumstances for Sarah, serving at the table, to identify the man as someone she knew, a freedman's cousin, a connection in the network of relationships that crossed the boundary between enslaved and nominally free in the Charleston community. She had memorized every detail of the conversation. 3 days later, she had passed that information through a series of intermediaries, a free black seamstress who delivered fabric to the house, who passed it to her husband, who knew people, and the man had been warned in time to prepare. She writes about this without drama. I heard what I needed to hear. I remembered what I needed to remember. I told what needed to be told. 6 words of explicit action inside 3 sentences that could, to a casual reader, be about anything. The photograph was Elizabeth's act of resistance, but Sarah's resistance was woven into its every detail. The choice to wear the silk dress was mutual, but it was Sarah who had in the weeks before quietly catalogued which dress was the right one, which would fit, which would photograph well. It was Sarah who had noted that Whitmore's studio back door opened onto an alley that connected to 2 different streets, providing 2 different exit routes. It was Sarah who had timed the walk from the Meeting Street house to King Street and back, and had established the sequence of plausible reasons for her absence from the household that morning if anyone asked. She had been planning and preparing and surviving by intelligence for years. The photograph was simply the moment when she and Elizabeth applied that intelligence to the same purpose at the same time. Then came the sale, March 1864, the coffle south to Alabama. What happened in Alabama in the weeks before Sarah's escape, in the specifics of what she endured before she found her way to the conductors of the Underground Railroad's Alabama routes, is not documented in anything Sarah left behind. The journal was confiscated or lost in the transfer. The blank page with Elizabeth's 4 words in the margin is the last physical artifact of the life she had built in Charleston. What we know is that she escaped. She traveled for weeks through a landscape at war, Union forces pushing north through Alabama, Confederate forces retreating and regrouping, the roads uncertain and dangerous for everyone and most dangerous of all for an escaped enslaved woman traveling without papers. She moved at night. She was guided by a network of people whose names she protected by never writing them down. She arrived in Philadelphia in November 1864 and asked a woman named Martha Thompson if she knew of an Elizabeth Ashford. That question, direct, purposeful, asked at the door of a stranger's boarding house after weeks of survival travel through a war zone, is the fullest expression of who Sarah was. She had not simply escaped. She had escaped towards something specific. She had held onto the one piece of information that mattered most through everything, and she had followed it to a Quaker boarding house in Philadelphia because that was where the truth she had been carrying for 26 years needed to land. You freed me in every way that mattered long before I left that place. She had said this to Elizabeth in the reunion described by Martha Thompson. It is the most compressed description of resistance's actual mechanism that this story contains. The freedom Elizabeth had given her was not freedom of movement. She had not been free to move. It was something else. The acknowledgement of her full humanity, the spoken truth of their relationship, the photograph that said this is real, this happened, this cannot be taken back even if the negative is inside a wall and the print is hidden in a sleeve. That was the freedom that had kept Sarah alive through Alabama. That was the freedom she had traveled to Philadelphia to complete. The cover-up of Elizabeth and Sarah's story was not dramatic. It did not involve men burning documents in the night, or officials threatening witnesses with violence, or a single powerful person deciding to suppress the truth. It was more dangerous than that. It was systematic, institutional, and administered with the comfortable efficiency of a society that had built its infrastructure specifically to make certain kinds of truth disappear. Robert Ashford and his brother James did not need to destroy evidence. They simply needed to use the legal mechanisms that already existed. The probate challenge of January 1864 is the central document. Robert Ashford's petition to the court is a masterwork of administrative erasure. It describes Elizabeth as unfit for the management of property and persons, language carefully calibrated to invoke her father's estate without mentioning anything that would require explanation. Unduly influenced by servants and Northern sympathizers was a legal formulation that the South Carolina courts of 1864 understood immediately. It meant she had treated an enslaved person as a person. That was sufficient. The witnesses the cousins produced, neighbors, the former overseer, the business partner, testified with the particular quality of witness testimony in societies built on the maintenance of comfortable fictions. They did not lie outright. They testified to things they had actually seen. But the things they chose to see, the things they chose to emphasize, the things they chose to describe as evidence of unfitness, these were selected with the precision of people who understood what the court wanted to hear and were prepared to provide it. No one mentioned the photograph. This is the detail that makes the cover-up legible as a system rather than an individual act. Everyone involved, the cousins, the witnesses, the court-appointed administrator, the slave broker who purchased Sarah, knew what they were doing in the broad sense. They were enforcing a social order that required certain truths to remain unspoken, but they were doing it through the mechanism of property law, probate law, the management of estates. The specific content of what had made Elizabeth unfit, the acknowledged kinship with Sarah, the photograph, the years of quiet solidarity, did not need to be named. The outcome did not require naming it. The administrative record of March 1864 is a piece of systematic dehumanization rendered in bureaucratic language of almost surreal orderliness. Household inventory, appraised values, sale prices. The name Sarah listed between a piece of furniture and a set of silverware with a dollar figure appended as evidence that the estate was being properly managed. The Charleston Mercury's notice of Elizabeth's departure. Miss Elizabeth Ashford has departed Charleston for parts unknown. Her relatives decline to comment on her whereabouts is the cover-up's final line. It does not call her a fugitive. It does not explain why a woman of good family would leave her home in wartime with no explanation. It simply notes the departure and declines to comment, in a formulation that closes the subject without acknowledging it. Jonathan Whitmore's studio was inspected by police the morning after the photograph was taken. His records were examined in connection with the 1866 court case where he appeared as a witness. He testified at that hearing about events he had witnessed during the war years in his capacity as a photographer, a court case related to insurance fraud, not to the Ashford family at all. His name appears in the newspaper coverage of that case and nowhere else in the official record. The negative inside his wall went with him to his grave, not literally but practically. When he died in 1889, his studio contents were purchased by a collector named James Morrison as part of a bulk acquisition of Civil War era photographic materials. Morrison catalogued what he could identify and bundled the rest. The print, the one Elizabeth had carried tucked inside her sleeve on September 14, 1863, was not in the studio. It had gone north with her. We do not know where it went after that. The negative inside the wall was in the bundle Morrison purchased without knowing it. When his collection was donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 1931, the negative, recovered at some point from the wall during a renovation, we assume, though no record of the discovery survives, had been printed, tucked into a catalogue of Southern portraits and labelled, Two Ladies of Charleston 1863, Unknown Subjects. Unknown, that word is the cover-up's last artifact, not malicious, not even by 1931 intentional, simply the result of 88 years of accumulated institutional forgetting. The system didn't need to actively suppress the story anymore. It just needed to wait and mislabel and trust that no one would look closely enough at the wrist of the woman on the right. It almost worked. It almost worked for 90 years. We're past the halfway point of this story, and if you haven't subscribed to Hollow Century yet, now is the moment. What you've just heard, the sale, the flight south, the probate challenge engineered to strip a woman of everything and call it due process. This is the history that gets filed under household accounts, miscellaneous in an archive until someone decides to look. Hit that like button, leave a comment. And stay with us, because the second half of this story is where Sarah and Elizabeth find each other again, and where a photograph sealed inside a wall in 1863 finally gets the explanation it has been waiting for. November 1864, a boarding house on Chestnut Street, Philadelphia. Martha Thompson heard the knock at her front door at 7:30 in the evening. She had heard that particular quality of knock before, urgent but careful, the knock of someone who had traveled far and was not certain of their welcome. She opened the door. The woman standing on the steps was young, perhaps 27 or 28 years old, and she was carrying nothing. No bag, no bundle, nothing that could not be abandoned in an instant. She wore clothes that had once been respectable and had traveled hard. Her shoes were wrong for the weather, thin leather in a Philadelphia November, and her feet, from her posture, were in significant pain. She asked for Elizabeth Ashford. Martha Thompson wrote later that she had learned, over years of this work, to read the relationship between people in the first moment of their reunion. She had seen parents find children. She had seen husbands find wives after years of separation. She had seen elderly men and women collapse at the sight of a sibling they had believed dead. She had not, she wrote, seen anything like what happened when Elizabeth Ashford came downstairs. The reunion lasted over an hour. Martha reports that neither woman was capable of speech for the first several minutes. They simply held each other and wept in the front parlor, while Martha stood in the hallway and tried to make herself invisible. Then the words came, fragmentary, overlapping, the particular language of two people who had been speaking in half-sentences and significant looks for 20 years and were suddenly, for the first time, in a place where they did not need to be careful. Elizabeth, I tried to free you. I should have found a way before they took you. I had the papers ready, I had the money, I thought we had more time. Sarah, you freed me in every way that mattered long before I left that place. The legal facts of what each woman had endured by this point were stark. Elizabeth had lost her home, her inheritance, her social standing, and her entire previous life. She had arrived in Philadelphia in July with the contents of a traveling bag and a name to ask for at the Wilmington Friends meeting. She had found work as a governess. She had attended the African Methodist Episcopal Church on South Street, where she was the only white regular attendee, and where she had quietly asked, for months, about networks and conductors, and whether anyone had heard news from Alabama about a young woman named Sarah. Sarah had survived months in the Deep South, in what circumstances she never wrote down and rarely spoke about. She had found the Underground Railroad's Alabama routes through a chain of connections that required, at each step, a calculation about who could be trusted. She had traveled by night for weeks. She had arrived in Philadelphia with nothing and had asked her first question before she had eaten or changed her clothes. The act of justice in this story is not a courtroom. It is not a sentence, not a verdict, not a formal acknowledgement by any institution that anything wrong had occurred. The act of justice is two women in a boarding house parlor on a cold November evening, together again after everything the system had thrown at them, both alive, both in a city where they could finally say what was true. That is not the justice the story deserved. Richard Ashford was never charged with anything. Robert and James Ashford retained their control of the estate and their social standing in Charleston until the end of the war, and continued in various forms of commercial activity afterward. Jonathan Whitmore kept his studio and his secrets and his negative until he died. The men who loaded Sarah onto a coffle and transporting her to Alabama face no names in any record that survived. The justice that exists here is the justice that Sarah and Elizabeth built for themselves, and they built it deliberately and in full, and with the same purposefulness that had characterized every act of resistance both of them had managed for their entire lives. Martha Thompson helped them find work. Elizabeth taught at a school for freedmen's children, a school funded by the Society of Friends, educating the children of people who had arrived in Philadelphia as her mother's generation had arrived from the South, without property, without documentation, without anything but the intelligence and the determination to survive. Sarah learned dressmaking formally in the workshop of a free black seamstress who had been in Philadelphia since 1849. By 1866, Sarah had her own clients. By 1867, she had her own small shop on Lombard Street. In September 1867, 4 years and 3 days after the photograph was taken, Sarah married Thomas, a carpenter and freedman from Virginia who had come north with the refugee tide of 1865. The wedding was small. Martha Thompson was there. Elizabeth was there. They had survived the system that had been designed to destroy them. They had found each other across an impossible distance. And now they were building a life together in a city that, for all its own limitations and prejudices, at least permitted them to be in the same room. The life that Sarah and Thomas built in Philadelphia over the following 20 years was ordinary in the best sense of the word, and that ordinariness was itself a kind of victory over a system that had worked very hard to make their survival impossible. Thomas's carpentry business grew steadily through the late 1860s and into the 1870s, as Philadelphia's building boom created demand for skilled tradesmen. By 1872, he had taken on 2 apprentices. By 1875, he had moved his operation to larger premises on South Street. Sarah's dressmaking shop remained small. She preferred it that way, she wrote in a letter to Elizabeth, because small meant she knew every client, knew every garment, knew the specific needs of each woman who walked through her door. She had learned from years of attending to Elizabeth Ashford's wardrobe that clothing was a form of communication, and she was an exceptionally skilled communicator. They had 4 children between 1868 and 1878. The eldest, Hannah, named for Sarah's mother, was born in March 1868. The second, James, in 1870. Then Clara in 1873 and William in 1878. All 4 were educated in the way that Sarah and Thomas made a specific priority of education, by sending them to the best schools available to black children in Philadelphia, and by continuing their education at home in the evenings, in a house full of books that Sarah collected with the specific pleasure of a woman who had grown up in a world where books were forbidden to her. Elizabeth Ashford never married. She continued teaching at the Freedmen's School through the 1870s, then transitioned to a position at a larger school in the 1880s that served both black and white students, a rare arrangement in Philadelphia, made possible by the Quaker philanthropist who funded the school's unusual integrated charter. She lived nearby to Sarah and Thomas for the rest of her life. She appears in family photographs from the 1870s and 1880s, standing slightly to the side of the main grouping, always present, always a little separate, described in family letters as Aunt Elizabeth without any further explanation offered or apparently needed. She died in 1903, age 68, in Philadelphia. Her death notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer describes her as a teacher of many years' service and a devoted friend to many families in this community. It mentions no surviving family. She had outlived her Philadelphia connections and had no contact, so far as the record shows, with any of the Ashford relatives in South Carolina. The notice is 4 sentences long. Sarah died in 1911, age 74. Her obituary in the Christian Recorder, the AME Church newspaper, the same paper that had covered the struggles of black Philadelphians since before the Civil War, is considerably longer. It describes her as a woman of extraordinary character whose life spanned one of history's most terrible and most transformative periods. It notes her dressmaking career, her 4 children, the 11 grandchildren she had lived to know. It does not mention Charleston. It does not mention slavery. The people who wrote it knew those things about her. They were not secrets. But this was her obituary, and her obituary was about who she had built herself into, not about what had been done to her. Hannah Ashford's children and grandchildren spread across the country in the first decades of the 20th century, as millions of black families did during the Great Migration, following opportunity north and west, building communities in cities, carrying their histories with them in the attenuated form that histories take when they cannot always be spoken directly. Margaret, Sarah's great-great-granddaughter, grew up in Brooklyn with stories about a woman named Sarah who had escaped slavery and made it to Philadelphia, and about a white woman who had helped the family. The details were vague. They had traveled through generations like whispers, true in substance but imprecise in specifics, the way oral history always travels when the documents are buried in archives labeled miscellaneous. The Ashford cousins, Robert and James, who had seized the estate and sold Sarah in 1864, continued in Charleston business life through the Reconstruction era and into the 1880s. Robert Ashford died in 1889, the same year as Jonathan Whitmore. James in 1893. Their descendants remained in South Carolina. In 2021, one of those descendants, a woman named Caroline, sent Margaret a message after seeing coverage of Rebecca Torr's research online. She wrote, "I am ashamed of what my ancestors did. They destroyed Elizabeth's life out of greed and prejudice. I want you to know that I honor what Elizabeth and Sarah did." Margaret and Caroline met in Charleston. They walked the streets. They found the site where Whitmore's studio had stood on King Street. They found Richard Ashford's grave, and nearby, in the section of the churchyard reserved for enslaved people, an unmarked plot where the record suggested Hannah had been buried in 1847. Together they arranged for a headstone. It reads, "Hannah, born 1812, died 1847, mother of Sarah, beloved." The photograph on page 47 of the Southern Portraits Catalogue had been waiting for 92 years when Rebecca Torrs opened that leather-bound book in March 2019. Trace it back, and every step of its survival was an accident that was almost not an accident. Jonathan Whitmore had plastered the oilskin-wrapped negative into his studio wall in September 1863 because he understood that a wet collodion negative, fragile, irreplaceable, evidence needed to be somewhere that casual search would not find it. He had prepared the hiding place in advance of the sitting. The cavity in the plaster was not discovered by accident. It was constructed with deliberate choice. He had built a vault inside a wall for a secret he intended to keep until it was safe to reveal. He died in 1889 without revealing it. His estate was settled quickly, a bachelor with no children, modest debts, the contents of a photography studio and a small apartment above it. James Morrison purchased the studio contents as a lot at the estate auction and took them to his warehouse on Meeting Street, where he spent 2 years cataloging the most identifiable items and bundling the rest. The oilskin package was in a box of miscellaneous plates and negatives. Morrison did not know what it was. He included it in the donation he made to the Charleston Historical Society in 1931, along with several hundred other items. Someone at the Historical Society at some point between 1931 and the catalogue's publication date had opened the oilskin, found the negative intact. Wet collodion processes produce a remarkably durable image under the right storage conditions, and printed it. The print went into the Southern Portraits catalogue. The negative was refiled with the other materials. The catalogue entry was written by someone who either did not know or did not care who the subjects were. Two ladies of Charleston, 1863, unknown subjects. 92 years in a catalogue in an archive waiting. Rebecca Torr's paper, published in the Journal of Civil War History in February 2020, Sisterhood Defiant, Kinship, Resistance and Photography in 1863, Charleston, went viral within 48 hours of publication. Not in the way that academic papers usually travel, slowly and narrowly through scholarly networks, but in the actual viral sense. It was shared on social media millions of times, picked up by every major news outlet, discussed on podcasts and in classrooms, referenced in 3 documentary proposals within the first month. The reaction that Rebecca described as most meaningful was not the media coverage. It was the emails, dozens, then hundreds from descendants of enslaved families who had found photographs of their own ancestors mislabeled, uncredited, listed as unknown in archives across the country. People saying, "Can you help me look? Can you teach me what you looked for?" The photograph had become a key, not just to Elizabeth and Sarah's story, but to a methodology, a way of looking at images that the archive had labeled unknown, and asking the question Rebecca had asked on that first afternoon: who were they really? The Charleston Historical Society mounted its exhibition, Hidden Kinship, the Ashford Sisters, in August 2020, 15 months after Rebecca had first opened the catalogue. The exhibition ran for 18 months. It traveled. It was seen by over 400,000 people in person and many more in its digital form. At the opening, Margaret stood before a crowd of 200 people and spoke without notes. She gestured to the enlarged photograph on the wall behind her, Elizabeth on the left, Sarah on the right, both in silk, both erect, both looking directly at the camera with the particular expression of people who know exactly what they are doing and have decided that the risk is worth it. This picture wasn't just a portrait, it was an act of revolution. They sat as equals, as sisters, in a world that would have punished them terribly for that simple truth. And you know what? They won. Because here we are more than 150 years later, and their truth is the thing that survived. The original negative is now preserved in acid-free archival storage at the Charleston Historical Society, which has digitized it at the highest resolution currently available and made the image freely accessible. It appears in textbooks. It has been referenced in legal scholarship about the history of property law and enslaved persons. It is taught in courses on the Civil War, on photography, on women's history, on the history of race in America. Sarah's journal is in the same collection. It has been transcribed in full and is available online. In the transcription, the last page, the page with Elizabeth's 4 words in a shaking hand, is reproduced at high resolution so that every reader can see, in the thickness and pressure of the pen strokes, exactly what it cost Elizabeth Ashford to write them. I tried, I failed, forgive. She had not failed. That is the thing the archive finally proved. The negative in the wall proved it. The journal in the miscellaneous box proved it. The diary entry in Philadelphia proved it. The headstone over Hannah's unmarked grave proved it. She had not failed at all. What happened in Charleston in September 1863 was not a love story, though love was present in it. It was not a rescue story, though survival was present in it. It was something more specific and more important. It was a story about what 2 people chose to do with the truth when every institution around them was organized around the suppression of that truth. The system Richard Ashford lived inside, the legal codes, the property laws, the social customs, the church memberships and business relationships and court procedures, was not designed by monsters. It was designed by ordinary people who had decided collectively that a specific kind of profit was worth a specific kind of lie, that enslaved people were property, that children born of rape had no claim on their fathers, that the categories of human value were fixed by birth and enforced by law and supported by God and could not, under any circumstances, be questioned in public. What Elizabeth Ashford and Sarah did, what Jonathan Whitmore enabled, was not, in the scale of history, a large act. 3 people in a room on a Tuesday morning, a camera, 15 seconds. But scale is not the measure of significance. The measure of significance is what survives. The slave codes are gone. The auction blocks are gone. The household inventories that listed human beings beside furniture and silverware are in archives rather than active use. The legal mechanisms that Robert Ashford used to strip Elizabeth of her home and sell Sarah to a broker in Montgomery, Alabama, they are gone, and they should be gone, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. But the pattern those mechanisms expressed, the use of institutional power to suppress inconvenient truths, to protect convenient fictions, to ensure that the people who benefit from a lie have better access to the legal system than the people who are damaged by it, that pattern did not disappear with the slave codes. It adapted, it found new instruments, it continues. And the response to that pattern, two people in a room deciding that one honest moment of documentation is worth the risk, that the truth written down outlasts the lie enforced at gunpoint, that also continues. Sarah's journal survived in a miscellaneous box for 156 years because someone put it in a box rather than a fire. Whitmore's negative survived inside a wall because he chose to build a vault rather than a bonfire. Martha Thompson's diary survived because she kept it and her descendants kept it, and eventually a historical society catalogued it. Every survival required someone choosing at some point to preserve rather than destroy. The archive is not neutral. The archive reflects the choices of the people who build it, what to keep, what to catalogue, what to label unknown subjects, and what to label with a name. The work that Rebecca Torres did in that Charleston reading room in March 2019 was not simply historical research. It was an argument about what the archive owes to the people it has chosen for 92 years not to name. That argument is not finished. There are 100,000 unmarked graves in churchyards across the South. There are millions of photographs in archives across this country labeled unknown or servant or attendant. There are inventories in storage boxes listing names without surnames, ages without birthdays, values without histories. There are people alive today who are the descendants of those names and who deserve to know them. The photograph on page 47 of the Southern Portraits Catalogue was found because someone looked closely enough to see a scar on a wrist. There are other photographs, there are other scars. Drop a comment and tell us which part of Elizabeth and Sarah's story hit you hardest, and what do you think we owe to the people whose histories are still buried in archives waiting for someone to look closely enough? Do you believe that the act of documentation, the photograph, the journal, the diary entry, is itself a form of justice? We want to hear from you. And if this story reached you, if it made you feel for a moment the weight of what Sarah carried and what Elizabeth chose and what Jonathan Whitmore preserved inside his wall, share it. Not for the algorithm, because this story deserves to travel as far as it can, because Sarah and Elizabeth took a risk for one honest image, and the least we can do is make sure that image is seen. Subscribe to Hollow Century for more stories from the shadows of history, the ones that powerful institutions spent generations trying to erase, the ones that survived in archives labeled miscellaneous, the ones that refuse to stay buried. Hit that notification bell. We are just getting started. And the truth, given enough time, always wins. I'll see you in the next one.